The arrival of Inspector Slack from Much Benham brought an immediate change to the atmosphere at St. Mary Mead. A tall, angular man with thinning hair and the perpetually skeptical expression of someone who had seen too many village mysteries complicate themselves unnecessarily. He surveyed the scene with obvious displeasure. His reputation for efficiency was matched only by his impatience with what he considered rural theatrics, and the elaborate nature of this particular crime clearly fell into that category. "Right then," he announced, his voice cutting through the subdued murmur of the remaining crowd. "Everyone connected with this performance stays put for questioning. The rest of you can go home, but I'll want proper statements from anyone who saw anything unusual today." His eyes swept dismissively over the bunting and abandoned pageant props, now seeming frivolous against the backdrop of tragedy. Sergeant Miller, relieved to hand over responsibility but somewhat deflated by his superior's brusque dismissal of his preliminary work, began the process of organizing witness statements, while Inspector Slack took charge of the immediate scene. The crowd, drawn by natural human fascination with tragedy but pushed away by official authority, began to disperse reluctantly into small, whispering clusters. Miss Marple remained beneath her chestnut tree, her knitting needles moving with deceptive casualness as she observed the unfolding investigation. She noted how differently people responded to the reality of murder versus the sanitized version they encountered in novels. Mrs. Pemberton from the post office kept glancing back at the coffin with horrified fascination, while young Mr. Davies from the bank had gone quite pale and seemed eager to escape entirely. Physical evidence and early discoveries. Dr. Thornfield, having regained some of his professional composure, completed his preliminary examination under Inspector Slack's watchful eye. "She's been dead for several hours," he reported quietly. "There are no obvious signs of violence, no wounds, no bruising, but there's a distinctive sweet, chemical smell about her. I suspect we're dealing with some form of poisoning, though a proper post-mortem will be necessary to determine the exact cause and timing." This revelation sent a new wave of unease through the remaining witnesses. Poisoning suggested premeditation and careful planning, quite different from a crime of passion or sudden violence. It also implied that the killer had access to dangerous substances and the knowledge to use them effectively. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to several details that seemed to escape the official investigation. The dampness at the hem of Cynthia's wedding dress suggested the body had been moved from elsewhere, somewhere wet like morning dew or freshly watered grass. The antique lace veil was clearly a family heirloom, not a theatrical prop, and its pristine condition suggested it had been handled with reverence rather than haste. Most intriguingly, she had noticed the white ribbon on the brass coffin handle had been retied with the precision of someone familiar with funeral customs. Not the nervous fidgeting Mrs. Blackwood had suggested, but the neat undertaker's bow one saw on formal floral tributes. The beer house discovery. While Inspector Slack conducted his interviews, Miss Marple took the opportunity for what she termed a little constitutional. Her quiet walk led her past the jam tent, where a spoon lay abandoned beside a bowl of gooseberry preserve, and toward the lich gate where the old beer house stood partially open. The stone lean-to, used for storing funeral equipment and Mrs. Blackwood's historical displays, smelled of dampness and old wood. Inside, she discovered the theatrical coffin lid propped against the wall, beside it a small bottle of oil and an oily cloth. Evidence that someone had indeed been working to silence squeaky hinges, as young Tom Sedgwick had mentioned. The floor showed clear evidence of recent activity, darker patches where moisture had risen to meet someone's feet, and a small piece of torn cellophane wrapper with a faint dusting of what appeared to be face powder. When Miss Marple bent to examine it more closely, she caught the faintest scent of orange blossom, an old-fashioned fragrance favored by ladies of a certain generation. Witness testimonies and revelations. Inspector Slack's systematic questioning began to reveal the complex web of relationships surrounding Cynthia Hartwell. Mrs. Hartwell, when pressed about the antique veil, confirmed it was indeed her mother's, kept in a trunk in the spare room. "I told Cynthia not to touch it," she said through her tears. "I said it was too much like inviting trouble. I never took it out." Dr. Thornfield's interview proved particularly revealing. Under Inspector Slack's persistent questioning, he admitted to receiving a letter that morning from London concerning Cynthia's previous romantic entanglement. "She had given me to understand it was finished," he said with hollow flatness. "It appears it was not. I begged her to allow me to write to the man. She refused." The doctor's account of their argument by the jam tent was corroborated by young Peggy Barnes, the postmistress's niece, who had witnessed the heated exchange. "He was telling her she couldn't go on with the show as if nothing had happened," Peggy reported with the satisfaction of someone whose eavesdropping had proved worthwhile. He was quite white around the mouth. Timeline and alibis. A crucial gap emerged in the timeline of Cynthia's final day. While several witnesses had seen her that morning helping with preparations and trying on the wedding dress costume, no one could account for her whereabouts between approximately 11 o'clock and the discovery of her body at 4:30. This 5.5-hour window represented the critical period during which the murder must have occurred. Mr. Sedgwick, the undertaker, remained adamant that he had locked the oak coffin immediately after its arrival and kept the key in his waistcoat pocket throughout the day. However, Miss Marple noted his nervous habit of patting the pocket repeatedly and his growing uncertainty when pressed about whether the key might have fallen out during his various duties. Young Tom Sedgwick provided one crucial piece of information. He had marked the theatrical coffin with a B in green chalk to distinguish it from the oak casket. Miss Marple observed the faint green dust along the ridge of his thumbnail and remembered the smear she had seen along the inside lip of the oak coffin, evidence that someone with chalky fingers had handled it before Colonel Weatherby's dramatic revelation. Village theories and gossip. As word of the murder spread through St. Mary Mead, the predictable theories began to circulate. The initial consensus, rooted in familiar village prejudices, suggested that such violence must have originated from outside their peaceful community, perhaps connected to Cynthia's mysterious London past or her unfortunate romantic entanglement. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to miss an opportunity for moral commentary, whispered to anyone who would listen about that sort of girl and her effect on the local young men. Colonel Weatherby, meanwhile, seemed more concerned with the potential damage to the village's reputation and the church roof fund than with the tragedy itself. Miss Marple observed these reactions with the careful attention of a naturalist studying behavior patterns. In her experience, the most revealing responses often came not from what people said, but from what they carefully avoided saying and how they positioned themselves in relation to the victim and each other. Emerging complexities. As the evening shadows lengthened and the official investigation continued, it became clear that this was no simple crime of passion. The elaborate staging of the discovery, the careful substitution of coffins, the preservation of the wedding dress costume, and the timing of the revelation during the pageant all suggested a killer who wanted their crime to be not just successful, but memorable. Miss Marple reflected on the curious theatricality of the entire situation. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure that Cynthia's death would be discovered in the most dramatic and public manner possible. Such elaborate staging usually served one of two purposes, either to conceal the killer's identity through misdirection or to send a specific message to someone in the community. The question that began to form in Miss Marple's mind was not simply who had killed Cynthia Hartwell, but why they had chosen to transform her death into such a macabre performance. The heritage fete had indeed become a showcase for tradition, but not the quaint customs Mrs. Blackwood had intended to celebrate. Instead, it had revealed the timeless human capacity for jealousy, revenge, and the kind of calculated malice that could transform a community celebration into a stage for murder. As Inspector Slack concluded his preliminary interviews and arranged for the body to be removed, Miss Marple quietly gathered her knitting and prepared to return home. Tomorrow would bring fresh revelations, she was certain, but tonight she had much to consider about the intricate web of relationships, secrets, and motives that had led to this moment. The bride who had slept in the wrong coffin had taken more than one secret to her grave, and Miss Marple suspected that uncovering those secrets would reveal truths that someone in St. Mary Mead was desperate to keep hidden. The morning after the heritage fete dawned with an oppressive stillness that seemed to muffle even the familiar sounds of village life. Miss Marple, rising at her customary early hour, observed from her bedroom window how the tragedy had already begun to reshape the rhythms of St. Mary Mead. The milk cart moved more quietly than usual, and even the sparrows seemed subdued in their morning chorus. The bunting that had fluttered so cheerfully the day before now hung limp and somehow accusatory in the still air. By 8:30, Inspector Slack had returned from Much Benham with Dr. Haydock, the police surgeon, whose preliminary examination would provide the foundation for the official investigation. Miss Marple, claiming a need for fresh air and exercise, found herself taking her morning constitutional along a route that happened to pass the vicarage grounds where the inspector was conducting his methodical review of the scene. The official investigation begins. Inspector Slack's approach to village mysteries was both systematic and impatient, a combination that often led to swift conclusions, though not always accurate ones. He had cordoned off the area around both coffins and was examining the oak casket with the thoroughness of a man who believed that physical evidence would provide clearer answers than the tangled web of village relationships and gossip. "The body was moved," he announced to Sergeant Miller, his voice carrying the authority of professional certainty. "The dampness on the dress hem, the way she was positioned, someone carried her here and arranged her deliberately. This wasn't where she died." He gestured toward the coffin with obvious distaste for its theatrical implications. "Someone wanted her found exactly like this, at exactly this moment. The question is why." Dr. Haydock emerged from his examination looking grave. "Poisoning, certainly," he confirmed. "That sweet, chemical odor is unmistakable, though I'll need laboratory analysis to determine the specific substance. What's clear is that death occurred several hours before the discovery. Rigor mortis patterns suggest sometime in the early morning hours, well before the fete began." This revelation cast the crime in an entirely different light. Rather than a spontaneous act of violence during the day's festivities, they were dealing with a calculated murder, followed by elaborate staging designed to maximize shock and confusion. The orange blossom connection. Miss Marple's quiet perambulation led her to call upon Mrs. Hartwell, ostensibly to offer condolences and perhaps a jar of her homemade preserves. The bereaved woman received her in the front parlor, where the lingering scent of orange blossom perfume created an almost overwhelming atmosphere of old-fashioned mourning. "Such a particular fragrance," Miss Marple observed gently, settling into the offered chair with her knitting bag. "It reminds me of my dear mother's wedding preparations. She always said orange blossom brought good fortune to brides." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes filled with fresh tears. "It was my mother's perfume," she whispered. "I keep the bottle in the spare room with her other things. Cynthia must have used it yesterday morning when she was trying on the veil. I found the bottle uncapped, and there was powder spilled on the dressing table." This detail struck Miss Marple as significant. Cynthia, by all accounts a modern young woman, would hardly have chosen such an old-fashioned scent for her theatrical performance. Yet someone had used that perfume, and recently enough for its fragrance to linger both in the spare room and, as Miss Marple now recalled, in the beer house where she had detected the same distinctive scent the previous evening. "The spare room key?" Miss Marple inquired with gentle curiosity. "I suppose it's always been kept in the same place." "In the tea caddy on the kitchen shelf," Mrs. Hartwell confirmed. "Everyone in the family has always known, but the trunk was already unlocked when I went to check on the veil yesterday morning. I thought perhaps I had been careless, but now She trailed off, the implications too disturbing to voice. Timeline reconstruction. Inspector Slack's methodical questioning of witnesses began to establish a clearer picture of the crucial hours. The vicar's gardener, a reliable man named Hodges, provided a key piece of information about the morning's activities. "Gave the boarders a proper soaking around noon, I did," he reported. "Mrs. Blackwood was quite particular about having everything perfect for the display. The grass was still wet when I finished. Took near an hour with all those flower beds." This explained the dampness on Cynthia's dress hem, suggesting her body had been moved across the wet grass sometime after Hodges completed his watering, but before the afternoon's festivities began. The window of opportunity was narrowing to a specific time frame when the killer could have transported the body without being observed. Young Tom Sedgwick, when questioned about his activities in the beer house, provided another crucial piece of the puzzle. His nervousness was evident as he described his morning preparations. "I was practicing the ribbon bow on the brass handle," he admitted reluctantly. "Father always says neatness is respect, but I couldn't get it right. The door to the beer house kept sticking because of the dampness, so I propped it open to let it dry while I went to fetch the oil rag from our workshop." This innocent act had inadvertently provided the killer with unsupervised access to the theatrical coffin and the opportunity to make the crucial substitution. Tom's green chalk, used to mark the theatrical coffin with B, had left traces that Miss Marple now realized she had observed on the brass fittings of the oak casket, evidence that someone with chalky fingers had handled both coffins. The staging revelation. As the investigation progressed, the elaborate nature of the staging became increasingly apparent. The killer had not simply disposed of a body, but had orchestrated a macabre performance designed to transform a community celebration into a stage for murder. This level of theatrical calculation suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the fete preparations and a particular desire to shock the entire village. Miss Marple reflected on the psychology behind such elaborate staging. In her extensive experience with human nature, she had observed that criminals who chose such dramatic presentations usually had one of two motivations. Either they sought to deflect suspicion through misdirection, or they wished to send a specific message to someone in the community. The careful preservation of the wedding dress costume, the use of the antique family veil, and the precise timing of the discovery all suggested the latter. Someone had wanted Cynthia's death to serve as more than simple elimination. It was meant to be a statement, a lesson, or perhaps a warning. Emerging suspects and motives, Dr. Thornfield's alibi for the crucial morning hours proved solid upon investigation. He had indeed been called to attend Mrs. Henderson, whose premature labor had required his attention from early morning until well past noon. However, his obvious distress over Cynthia's London entanglement and his access to various chemical substances kept him within Inspector Slack's sphere of interest. Roderick Ashworth presented a more complex picture. His admission of financial difficulties and his obvious infatuation with Cynthia provided clear motives, while his vague account of his morning activities left ample opportunity for involvement in the crime. When pressed about his whereabouts during the crucial hours, he could only claim to have been walking the grounds and thinking about family matters. Most intriguingly, his description of Cynthia as someone who laughed at tradition and lived too much in the present suggested a deeper conflict between them than mere romantic disappointment. The elaborate staging of her death, with its emphasis on old-fashioned wedding customs and family heirlooms, seemed almost like a response to such attitudes, a forced return to the traditions she had allegedly scorned. Miss Marple's quiet deductions. As evening approached and Inspector Slack prepared to expand his investigation beyond the immediate village, Miss Marple sat in her garden, reflecting on the day's revelations. The threads of the mystery were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. The killer possessed several distinct characteristics. intimate knowledge of village routines and fete preparations, access to both the Hartwell cottage and the church grounds, familiarity with funeral customs sufficient to tie proper undertakers' bows, and the psychological complexity to transform murder into theatrical statement. Most significantly, they had chosen to honor Cynthia in death with the very traditions she had allegedly rejected in life: the antique veil, the orange blossom perfume, the formal wedding presentation. This suggested someone who felt personally affronted by her modern attitudes and who wished to impose their own vision of proper feminine behavior, even in death. The bride, who should have been performing a quaint village pageant, had instead become the centerpiece of a far more sinister drama, one in which the killer had cast themselves as both director and moral arbiter. Miss Marple suspected that understanding this theatrical impulse would prove key to identifying the murderer. For in her experience, such elaborate staging always revealed more about the criminal's psychology than they intended. As the church clock struck 9 and the village settled into an uneasy evening, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with the steady rhythm of someone whose mind was working methodically through a complex problem. Tomorrow would bring fresh revelations, she was certain. But tonight she had much to consider about the particular vanity that could transform community celebration into a stage for murder, and the kind of person who would choose to teach their final lesson with a corpse as their most eloquent argument. The morning after brought Dr. Haydock's official post-mortem report, delivered to Inspector Slack with the crisp efficiency that marked all official communications from Much Benham. The document confirmed what the experienced police surgeon had suspected from his preliminary examination the previous day. Cynthia Hartwell had died from a lethal dose of digitalis, the powerful cardiac glycoside extracted from the common foxglove plant. Digitalis poisoning, Dr. Haydock explained to Inspector Slack as they stood in the morning sunlight outside the police station. The sweet chemical scent we detected was likely the digitalis itself, possibly mixed with something to make it more palatable. Death would have occurred within hours of ingestion, depending on the dose and the victim's constitution. What's particularly significant is that this wasn't a crude preparation. Whoever administered this knew exactly what they were doing. This revelation immediately narrowed the field of potential suspects, while simultaneously expanding the complexity of the case. Digitalis required specific knowledge to extract and prepare effectively, suggesting someone with either medical training or extensive botanical expertise. Moreover, the precision of the dosage indicated a killer who had planned carefully, not someone acting in a moment of passion. The London connection emerges. Miss Marple's morning constitutional led her past the post office, where she encountered young Peggy Barnes, sorting the morning mail with unusual agitation. The girl's nervous energy was immediately apparent, and Miss Marple's gentle inquiries soon revealed the source of her distress. "It's about yesterday morning, Miss Marple," Peggy confided, glancing nervously toward Mrs. Pemberton, who was occupied with the telegraph machine. "That registered letter for Miss Cynthia, from Vane and Laurier on the Strand in London. I've been thinking about it all night, and I'm certain now that it wasn't Miss Cynthia who signed for it." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their steady rhythm. "How can you be so certain, dear?" Miss Cynthia had such a distinctive way of writing her C, like a twisted ribbon, all flourishes and personality. I noticed it particularly when she signed for the vicar's books last week, but yesterday's signature was different. Rounder, neater, more old-fashioned, like someone trying to write carefully rather than naturally. This detail cast the previous day's events in an entirely new light. If Cynthia hadn't signed for the letter herself, then someone else had intercepted correspondence that might have contained crucial information about her London plans. Miss Marple thanked Peggy warmly and continued her walk, her mind already working through the implications of this deception. The foxglove discovery. Her route naturally led her past the churchyard, where the investigation had left its mark in cordoned areas and disturbed ground. However, it was not the official crime scene that caught Miss Marple's attention, but rather a small disturbance she noticed near the old stone wall that bordered the church grounds. There, partially concealed by the drooping leaves of a cluster of foxgloves, someone had recently disturbed the earth. The patch was no larger than a handprint, but to Miss Marple's experienced gardener's eye, it was clearly fresh. Someone had been digging here within the past few days, perhaps gathering roots or samples from these particular plants. The location was significant, close enough to the church to be easily accessible during the fete preparations, yet far enough from the main activity to avoid casual observation. Miss Marple examined the foxgloves more closely, noting their robust health and the particular variety. Digitalis purpurea, the common purple foxglove that contained the highest concentration of the deadly cardiac glycosides. Someone with botanical knowledge would know exactly which plants to select and how to process them for maximum potency. Mrs. Blackwood's revealing behavior. Her observations were interrupted by the approach of Mrs. Blackwood herself, who appeared from the direction of the vicarage with her characteristic air of purposeful authority. However, Miss Marple noted several details that struck her as significant. A faint dusting of what appeared to be dried plant matter on Mrs. Blackwood's gloves, the lingering scent of orange blossom that seemed to follow her despite her earlier protestations about not using perfume during daylight hours, and most tellingly, the nervous way she avoided looking toward the foxglove patch. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Blackwood announced with forced cheerfulness, "I trust you're not dwelling too much on yesterday's unpleasantness. The vicar and I have decided that the best course is to focus on healing the community's wounds through positive action." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I was just admiring these lovely foxgloves. Such vigorous specimens. Someone clearly tends them with great care." Mrs. Blackwood's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face flushed slightly, and she glanced involuntarily toward the disturbed patch of earth before catching herself. "I'm sure I wouldn't know about such things," she said stiffly. "The churchyard maintenance is entirely the responsibility of old Hodges." Yet Miss Marple had observed Mrs. Blackwood's extensive knowledge of local flora during numerous village garden competitions and botanical society meetings. Her sudden claim of ignorance about plants she had previously discussed with expertise suggested a deliberate attempt to distance herself from any connection to the foxgloves. The tradition versus modernity. Conflict as their conversation continued. Mrs. Blackwood's true feelings about Cynthia began to emerge with increasing clarity. Her initial expressions of sympathy gradually gave way to more pointed observations about the victim's character and behavior. "I don't wish to speak ill of the dead," Mrs. Blackwood said with a particular tone that indicated she was about to do exactly that. "But Cynthia was never truly suited to our village ways, always questioning traditions, suggesting improvements, laughing at customs that have served St. Mary Mead well for generations. Why, just last week she told me the sleeping bride tradition was morbid and outdated. Said she was only participating because Dr. Thornfield had asked her to." This revelation provided crucial insight into the killer's psychology. If Cynthia had indeed dismissed the very tradition she was later found representing in death, then her positioning in the oak coffin, dressed in antique wedding finery, took on the character of a deliberate rebuke, a forced participation in the customs she had scorned. The registered letter investigation Inspector Slack's systematic approach had led him to contact the London firm of Vane and Laurier, whose response arrived by telephone that morning. The news was significant. They had indeed sent a registered letter containing a contract offer for a small but promising role in a touring production. More importantly, they had expected Cynthia to return to London within the week to finalize the arrangements. This information cast Dr. Thornfield's emotional state in a new light. His argument with Cynthia by the jam tent had likely concerned not just their relationship, but her imminent departure for London and a return to the theatrical career he had hoped she would abandon for marriage to him. The letter represented not just professional opportunity, but the definitive end of his romantic hopes. When confronted with this information, Dr. Thornfield's composure finally cracked completely. "She never told me about the contract," he admitted, his voice hollow with grief and betrayal. "I knew there had been discussions, but I believed she had decided against returning to that life. When I saw her preparing for the pageant, laughing and joking about the quaint village customs, I realized she was already gone in her heart." Timeline reconstruction. The investigation began to establish a clearer sequence of events for the crucial morning hours. Mrs. Hartwell confirmed that she had been occupied in the kitchen when the registered letter arrived, leaving Mrs. Blackwood alone upstairs with access to both the correspondence and the family heirlooms. The orange blossom perfume, she revealed, had indeed been used that morning, not by Cynthia, but by someone who had opened the antique bottle in the spare room. "I found the bottle uncapped when I went to check on the veil later," Mrs. Hartwell explained tearfully. "There was powder spilled on the dressing table, and the scent was much stronger than it should have been. I thought perhaps Cynthia had been experimenting with grandmother's things, but now I wonder." Young Tom Sedgwick provided another crucial piece of the timeline when he reluctantly admitted to seeing a figure with a hat box near the lich gate around 1 o'clock. His description was frustratingly vague. The sun had been in his eyes, and he couldn't be certain whether it was Mrs. Blackwood, Mrs. Hartwell, or another woman entirely. However, his certainty about the time was absolute, as he had been listening for the church clock to know when to return to his preparations. Miss Marple's growing understanding. As the afternoon progressed and the various threads of evidence began to weave together, Miss Marple found herself developing a clearer picture of the killer's psychology and methodology. This was someone who possessed not only the botanical knowledge to prepare digitalis effectively, but also the intimate familiarity with village routines necessary to intercept correspondence, access private homes, and manipulate the fete preparations for maximum dramatic effect. Most significantly, the killer appeared to be motivated by a deep-seated conflict between traditional values and modern attitudes, a conflict that had found its ultimate expression in the elaborate staging of Cynthia's death. The careful arrangement of the body in traditional wedding attire, complete with family heirlooms and old-fashioned perfume, represented more than simple murder. It was a statement about proper feminine behavior and the consequences of rejecting established customs. The precision required to coordinate the poisoning, the body transportation, the coffin substitution, and the timing of the discovery suggested someone with both meticulous planning abilities and intimate knowledge of all the participants' schedules and habits. This was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act of moral judgment executed with theatrical flair. As evening approached and Inspector Slack prepared to expand his investigation to include the London theatrical connection, Miss Marple reflected on the particular vanity that could transform community celebration into a stage for murder. The killer had not simply eliminated someone who threatened their worldview. They had attempted to rewrite the narrative of Cynthia's life, forcing her to embody in death the very traditions she had rejected in life. The bride who had slept in the wrong coffin had indeed become part of a larger performance, one in which the killer sought to demonstrate the ultimate triumph of tradition over modernity, propriety over independence, and their own moral authority over the victim's personal choices. Understanding this psychological landscape would prove crucial to identifying the murderer, for in Miss Marple's extensive experience, such elaborate moral theatre always revealed more about the perpetrator's character than they intended to expose. The foxgloves nodded gently in the evening breeze, their purple blooms beautiful and deadly, while somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a killer waited to see whether their carefully orchestrated lesson would be understood by those who remained to interpret its meaning. The third morning brought Dr. Haydock's comprehensive post-mortem report, delivered with the clinical precision that marked all communications from the much Benham medical examiner. Inspector Slack received the document in the vicarage study, where the morning light streaming through diamond-paned windows seemed almost too cheerful for the grim business at hand. Digitalis purpurea, Dr. Haydock confirmed, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed his findings. A sophisticated preparation, not the crude garden variety one might expect from amateur poisoning. The extraction was professionally done, combined with a masking agent that would have rendered the bitter taste almost undetectable when mixed with something sweet. We are dealing with someone who possesses considerable botanical or pharmaceutical knowledge. Inspector Slack made careful notes, his satisfaction evident at having concrete evidence to work with. However, Miss Marple, who had arrived ostensibly to deliver a jar of her homemade marmalade to the vicar's wife, found herself troubled by the implications. In her extensive experience with human nature, the most obvious conclusions often proved the most dangerous, particularly when they confirmed existing assumptions about criminal capability. The undertaker's professional pride. Miss Marple's morning constitutional led her to Sedgwick and Sons, where she had arranged to order memorial cards for an elderly friend from her London days. Mr. Cornelius Sedgwick received her in the hushed atmosphere of his showroom, where polished oak and gleaming brass fittings spoke of professional dignity maintained across generations. "It was a monstrous liberty, Miss Marple," Mr. Sedgwick declared, his thin face bearing the wounded expression of a craftsman whose work had been perverted. "My finest casket used as a theatrical prop for murder. The very thought offends every principle of professional conduct." Miss Marple observed his demonstration of proper funeral ribbons with the careful attention she reserved for potentially significant details. "Such precise work," she murmured admiringly. "I noticed at the fete that the ribbon had been tied rather differently. The ends seemed reversed from your usual method." Mr. Sedgwick's eyebrows rose with professional outrage. "There is no variation in propriety, Miss Marple. One loops right over left, never the reverse. It's a matter of training and respect. Young Tom struggles with the technique, being naturally left-handed, but I corrected his work twice before luncheon. Someone with untrained hands had been interfering with my display." This revelation struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. The precise tying of funeral ribbons required specific knowledge and practice, not something an amateur would master without extensive experience in mortuary customs. Botanical expertise revealed her afternoon visit to Mrs. Blackwood, ostensibly to discuss the church flower arrangements, proved equally enlightening. She found her hostess in the conservatory, surrounded by an impressive collection of medicinal plants that revealed a level of botanical sophistication far beyond casual gardening. The conservatory itself was a testament to Mrs. Blackwood's expertise. Carefully labeled specimens, precise growing conditions, and a well-equipped work area complete with mortar and pestle, amber bottles, and detailed extraction notes. Miss Marple noted several rare varieties of digitalis, including subspecies known for their particularly potent cardiac glycosides. "Such an extensive collection," Miss Marple observed, settling into the offered chair with her knitting. "I'm particularly impressed by your digitalis specimens. The cultivation must require considerable expertise." Mrs. Blackwood's reaction was immediate and revealing. Her confident handling of the delicate plants suddenly became clumsy, and she nearly upset a small bottle of concentrated extract. "These are merely common garden varieties," she said stiffly, though the evidence of her sophisticated knowledge surrounded them. As their conversation progressed, Mrs. Blackwood's true feelings about Cynthia began to emerge with increasing clarity. What had initially appeared as mild social disapproval gradually revealed itself as a passionate moral crusade against what she perceived as the corruption of traditional values. "Girls like Cynthia Hartwell represent everything wrong with the modern world," Mrs. Blackwood declared, her composure cracking under the weight of her convictions. "No respect for tradition, always questioning authority, encouraging others to abandon the customs that have served our community for generations. She was poisoning young minds with her London ideas and theatrical nonsense." Miss Marple noted the unconscious choice of words and the evangelical fervor with which the condemnation was delivered. This was not mere social disapproval, but a genuine belief that Cynthia represented an existential threat to the community's moral foundation. New witness evidence. Inspector Slack's methodical canvassing of the village had uncovered a previously unknown witness, Mr. Plummet, the reclusive artist whose cottage overlooked the path to the church. The elderly man had been sketching the morning light on the ancient stones when he observed something significant. "Saw someone near the churchyard between 11 and noon," Mr. Plummet reported, his watery eyes blinking behind thick spectacles. Carrying a hat box they were. Paused by the foxgloves, seemed to be gathering something, then went into the beer house. Stayed a good quarter hour and came out without the hat box. This testimony provided crucial confirmation of the timeline and suggested that the hat box had contained materials essential to the crime staging. Miss Marple reflected on the implications. Someone had transported the wedding dress, veil, and other staging materials to the church grounds during the crucial morning hour. The chalk-dust connection. Young Tom Sedgwick's nervous testimony about his morning preparations revealed another significant detail. His green chalk, used to mark the theatrical coffin with B, had left traces on his hands that transferred to everything he touched. Miss Marple had observed similar green dust on the brass fittings of the oak casket, evidence that someone with chalky fingers had handled both coffins. "I was practicing the ribbon bow," Tom admitted reluctantly. "Father's always particular about neatness, but I couldn't get it right. Had to oil the hinges too. The dampness made everything squeak." This innocent preparation had inadvertently provided the killer with unsupervised access to both coffins and the opportunity to make the crucial substitution that would ensure Cynthia's body was discovered in the most dramatic manner possible. The attempted second poisoning. The investigation took an alarming turn when Mrs. Hartwell received an anonymous gift basket containing eggs, bread, and a jar of beef tea. The accompanying note, written in careful, old-fashioned script, read simply, "With sympathy from a friend." Miss Marple's instinctive caution about the beef tea proved well-founded when Dr. Haydock's analysis revealed another cardiac poison, different from digitalis, but equally deadly. "Someone's pharmaceutical work hasn't improved with practice," he observed grimly. "This suggests our killer either fears what Mrs. Hartwell might remember or wishes to complete some larger plan." The attempted second poisoning revealed the killer's desperation and confirmed that this was not a single act of violence, but part of a broader campaign against those who threatened their moral worldview. Miss Marple's growing understanding. As evening approached and Inspector Slack prepared to expand his investigation beyond the village boundaries, Miss Marple reflected on the psychological landscape that had produced such an elaborate crime. The killer possessed several distinct characteristics: intimate knowledge of village routines, access to sophisticated botanical preparations, familiarity with funeral customs, and the psychological complexity to transform murder into moral theater. Most significantly, they had chosen to honor Cynthia in death with the very traditions she had allegedly rejected in life. The antique veil, the orange blossom perfume, the formal wedding presentation. This suggested someone who felt personally affronted by her modern attitudes and wished to impose their own vision of proper feminine behavior, even in death. The precision required to coordinate the poisoning, body transportation, coffin substitution, and timing of the discovery indicated someone with both meticulous planning abilities and intimate knowledge of all participants' schedules and habits. This was not a crime of passion, but a calculated act of moral judgment executed with theatrical flair. The bride who had slept in the wrong coffin had become the centerpiece of a morality play written in blood and staged with flowers, where someone had appointed themselves both director and moral arbiter. Miss Marple suspected that understanding this theatrical impulse would prove key to identifying the murderer, for in her experience, such elaborate staging always revealed more about the criminal's psychology than they intended. As the church clock struck 9 and an uneasy quiet settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with the steady rhythm of someone whose mind was methodically working through a complex problem. The threads were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly elusive. Tomorrow would bring fresh revelations, she was certain, but tonight she had much to consider about the particular vanity that could transform community celebration into a stage for murder, and the kind of person who would choose to teach their final lesson with death as their most eloquent argument. The heritage fete had indeed showcased tradition, but not the charming customs Mrs. Blackwood had intended to celebrate. Instead, it had revealed the timeless human capacity for moral fanaticism and the length to which some would go to impose their vision of propriety on an increasingly modern world. The morning after the attempted poisoning brought a palpable shift in the atmosphere of St. Mary Mead. Inspector Slack arrived at the vicarage with Dr. Haydock's comprehensive analysis of the tainted beef tea, his usual methodical confidence now edged with genuine concern. The discovery of a second, different cardiac poison, Convallaria majalis, derived from lily of the valley, confirmed that they were dealing with someone whose botanical expertise extended far beyond casual gardening. 2 different poisons, 2 different extraction methods, Dr. Haydock reported grimly. The first was sophisticated digitalis preparation, the second a cruder but equally lethal lily of the valley concentrate. Our killer either has extensive pharmaceutical knowledge or access to detailed botanical references. This isn't amateur experimentation. It's the work of someone with formal training in plant chemistry. Miss Marple, who had arrived ostensibly to deliver fresh scones to the vicar's wife, found herself positioned where she could observe Inspector Slack's growing frustration with the case's complexity. The attempted elimination of Mrs. Hartwell suggested a killer operating from desperation rather than confidence, someone whose carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble under official scrutiny. The handwriting revelation. Her morning constitutional led her to the post office, where young Peggy Barnes had laid out the registered letter book with obvious anxiety. The girl's nervous energy was immediately apparent as she pointed to the signature that had troubled her since the morning of the fete. "I've been studying it all night, Miss Marple," Peggy confided, glancing nervously toward Mrs. Pemberton. "Miss Cynthia's signature was always so distinctive, like ribbons dancing across the page. But this one is different entirely. See how the letters are formed with such careful precision. It's the handwriting of someone who learned penmanship in an earlier era, when every stroke was meant to reflect moral character." Miss Marple examined the signature with a careful attention she reserved for potentially crucial evidence. The formation was indeed telling, each letter crafted with the meticulous care of someone who viewed proper penmanship as inseparable from proper behavior. When she discreetly compared it to samples from the church flower arrangement schedules and parish newsletter contributions, the pattern became unmistakable. "There's more," Peggy whispered. "A telegram was sent to London that same morning, 10:47 exactly. Regret cannot accept role. C. Hartwell." But the handwriting on the form was that same old-fashioned style, nothing like Miss Cynthia's natural hand. This revelation cast the entire timeline in a different light. Someone had not only intercepted Cynthia's correspondence, but had actively sabotaged her London opportunities, sending a false refusal in her name, while she remained unaware of the deception. The Hatbox discovery. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to the beer house yielded another crucial piece of evidence. In the dusty corner where old funeral equipment was stored, she discovered a dark green leather hat box that seemed oddly out of place among the weathered containers. Unlike the others, this one bore no dust of age, and when she examined its interior, she detected the faint but unmistakable scent of orange blossom. More significantly, running her finger along the inside rim revealed a thin layer of fine, greenish-gray dust, the same chalk residue that young Tom Sedgwick had left on everything he touched during his morning preparations. The hat box had clearly been used to transport something that had come into contact with the green chalk, something that had required careful handling and concealment. Miss Marple reflected on Mr. Plummett's testimony about seeing someone with a hat box near the foxglove. The container had not been empty when it arrived, nor had it contained a hat. Instead, it had served as a discreet transport vessel for the materials needed to stage Cynthia's death. The antique veil, the wedding dress, perhaps even the prepared digitalis that would end the young woman's life. Mrs. Blackwood's deteriorating composure. Her subsequent visit to Mrs. Blackwood's conservatory revealed a woman under increasing psychological pressure. The usually immaculate guardian of village traditions appeared disheveled, her hands trembling slightly as she tended to her extensive collection of medicinal plants. The sophisticated apparatus surrounding her, mortar and pestle, amber bottles, detailed extraction notes, spoke of expertise far beyond casual botanical interest. "Such beautiful digitalis specimens," Miss Marple observed gently, settling into the offered chair with her knitting. "The cultivation must require considerable knowledge to achieve such potency." Mrs. Blackwood's reaction was immediate and revealing. Her confident handling of the delicate plants suddenly became clumsy, and she nearly upset a small bottle of concentrated extract. "These are merely common garden varieties," she said stiffly, though the evidence of sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge surrounded them. As their conversation continued, Mrs. Blackwood's carefully maintained composure began to crack, revealing the passionate moral crusader beneath the refined exterior. "The corruption spreads like a disease," she declared, her voice rising with evangelical fervor. "First it was Cynthia with her theatrical nonsense and rejection of proper feminine roles. But the infection continues. Young women abandoning traditional values, questioning their elders, embracing the moral decay of modern life." The present tense of her condemnation, "the infection continues," suggested that her moral campaign had not ended with Cynthia's death, but remained an active motivation for further action. The ribbon technique. Inspector Slack's methodical examination of the funeral preparations revealed another significant clue. Mr. Sedgwick's professional pride in proper ribbon tying had been offended by someone's interference with his display, and his description of the incorrect technique proved illuminating. "The ribbon was tied left over right," he explained with obvious distaste. "Completely wrong for funeral work. Anyone properly trained knows you loop right over left. It's a matter of respect and tradition. Only someone left-handed or improperly trained would make such an error." Miss Marple filed this detail away, with the growing collection of evidence pointing to Mrs. Blackwood's involvement. The woman's left-handed tendencies, observed during various church activities, would naturally lead to such a reversal of the traditional technique. The telegraph deception. The discovery of the false telegram sent in Cynthia's name provided crucial insight into the killer's methodology and timeline. Someone had not only intercepted the London contract, but had actively worked to sabotage Cynthia's career prospects, sending a professional refusal, while the young woman remained unaware of either the opportunity or its rejection. Inspector Slack's telephone conversation with Vane and Laurier revealed the full scope of the deception. The theatrical agency confirmed receiving the morning refusal, followed by a frantic afternoon message attempting to retract it. This second communication bearing Cynthia's genuine handwriting style and desperate tone. "We assumed the young lady had simply changed her mind twice in one day," the agent explained with professional resignation. "It happens frequently in our business. However, the contrast between the formal morning refusal and the emotional afternoon retraction was quite striking." This timeline suggested that Cynthia had discovered the deception sometime during the day and had attempted to rectify it, perhaps explaining her argument with Dr. Thornfield and her determination to proceed with the pageant despite the emotional turmoil. Miss Marple's strategic move. As evening approached and the various threads of evidence began to weave together into a coherent pattern, Miss Marple made a calculated decision. She approached the vicar with a request that seemed innocuous, but was carefully designed to apply pressure to the killer's increasingly fragile composure. "Perhaps you might mention in tomorrow's announcements," she suggested gently. that the police have found useful evidence on certain items from the fete. A piece of ribbon and an old bottle discovered in the beer house. It would be helpful if anyone with information about the preparations came forward before Thursday's tea. It was nothing more than a gentle probe, but Miss Marple understood the psychology of moral fanatics. People who appointed themselves guardians of community virtue operated on the assumption that their own actions were beyond scrutiny. The suggestion that physical evidence might contradict their carefully constructed narrative would create precisely the kind of psychological pressure that could force a revealing response. The pattern emerges. As she sat in her parlor that evening, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic steady rhythm, Miss Marple reflected on the complete picture that had emerged from the investigation. Mrs. Blackwood possessed all the necessary elements: intimate knowledge of village routines, sophisticated botanical expertise, access to the Hartwell cottage and church grounds, and the psychological complexity to transform murder into moral theater. Most significantly, she had demonstrated the particular form of fanaticism that could justify any action in service of what she perceived as traditional values. Her interception of Cynthia's correspondence, her preparation of the digitalis poison, her elaborate staging of the death scene, and her attempted elimination of Mrs. Hartwell all served a single purpose: the enforcement of her rigid moral vision upon a community she believed was losing its way. The bride who had slept in the wrong coffin had become the unwilling centerpiece of a morality play written by someone who genuinely believed that death could serve as a teacher, demonstrating to St. Mary Mead the ultimate consequences of rejecting the customs and values that had sustained previous generations. Mrs. Blackwood had not simply committed murder. She had orchestrated an elaborate lesson in the dangers of modernity, using Cynthia's death as her most persuasive argument for the supremacy of tradition over progress. As the church clock struck 9 and an uneasy quiet settled over the village, Miss Marple continued her knitting with the steady rhythm of someone whose understanding of human nature had once again proven both accurate and deeply troubling. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation she had carefully orchestrated, and she suspected that Mrs. Blackwood's response to the implied threat of physical evidence would provide the final confirmation needed to bring this tragic chapter to its inevitable conclusion. The Heritage Fete had indeed showcased tradition, but not the charming customs Mrs. Blackwood had intended to celebrate. Instead, it had revealed the dangerous intersection of moral certainty, sophisticated knowledge, and the particular vanity that could transform community celebration into a stage for murder. The morning after Miss Marple's strategic suggestion brought the vicar's measured announcement during prayers, delivered with his customary gentle earnestness, but carrying an undercurrent that rippled through the small congregation like a stone dropped in still water. He spoke of the ongoing police investigation, mentioning almost as an afterthought that Inspector Slack had expressed particular interest in certain items recovered from the beer house, a piece of ribbon and an old bottle that might help clarify the timeline of events. Miss Marple, observing from her usual pew with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades studying human nature in its most unguarded moments, noted the immediate and telling effect of these carefully chosen words. Mrs. Blackwood's prayer book, which had been held with rigid piety, suddenly seemed clutched with barely controlled tension. Her carefully composed features flickered with something between alarm and calculation before she forced them back into an expression of serene devotion. The village responds. The announcement spread through St. Mary Mead with the reliable speed of all significant news in small communities. By the time the congregation filed out into the morning sunlight, the whispered conversations carried an electric undercurrent that suggested Miss Marple's probe had found its mark with surgical precision. Physical evidence from the beer house, Mrs. Price Ridley repeated to anyone within earshot, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone whose suspicions were being validated by official investigation. A ribbon and an old bottle, the vicar said. I always maintained that proper scientific methods would expose whoever perpetrated this dreadful business. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically in the churchyard, where the morning light fell gently across the ancient stones and the foxgloves nodded in their border along the wall. The same foxgloves where someone had recently disturbed the earth. She was not surprised when Mrs. Blackwood approached with the determined stride of someone who had reached a crucial decision about damage control. Mrs. Blackwood's revealing visit. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Blackwood began, her voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that fooled no one familiar with her usual commanding tone. "I understand the police have found some items in the beer house. As someone responsible for coordinating the fete preparations, I feel I should examine them to determine their significance to our community celebration." The presumption was telling. Mrs. Blackwood's immediate assumption that she should have access to police evidence revealed both her sense of entitlement and her desperate need to control the narrative that was increasingly slipping from her grasp. "How thoughtful of you," Miss Marple replied mildly, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she observed the subtle signs of psychological pressure taking their toll. "Though I believe Inspector Slack prefers to handle evidence himself. Such careful procedures, you know, to ensure nothing is contaminated or misinterpreted by well-meaning civilians." The suggestion that her expertise might not be required, or worse, might contaminate crucial evidence, clearly agitated Mrs. Blackwood further. Her carefully maintained composure began to show additional stress fractures as she pressed for more specific information about what had been discovered and when it might be examined by someone with proper understanding of village customs and traditions. The psychological pressure builds. As their conversation continued in the peaceful churchyard setting, Mrs. Blackwood's need to control every aspect of the investigation became increasingly apparent. She offered elaborate explanations for every detail of the fete preparations, emphasizing her central roles in organizing displays and managing logistics with the fervor of someone whose entire identity was bound up in being the moral authority of St. Mary Mead. "I personally supervised every aspect," she declared with growing intensity. "The coffin arrangements, the costume preparations, even the flower displays. Nothing occurred without my direct knowledge and approval." Miss Marple noted the unconscious shift in Mrs. Blackwood's language, from collaborative descriptions of community effort to possessive claims of personal control. This was someone who viewed the entire event as her creation, her stage for demonstrating the superiority of traditional values over what she perceived as modern corruption. "Such dedication must have been exhausting," Miss Marple observed gently. "You must have been up quite early on the morning of the fete to ensure everything was properly arranged." Mrs. Blackwood's response revealed another telling detail about the crucial timeline. "I was up before dawn," she admitted, then seemed to realize the implications of such early activity when no preparations should have required pre-dawn attention. "That is, I wanted to ensure everything was perfect for our community celebration of heritage and tradition." The botanical evidence emerges. Their conversation gradually turned to the extensive flower arrangements that had adorned the fete grounds, providing Miss Marple with the opportunity to probe Mrs. Blackwood's botanical expertise more directly. The woman's knowledge was indeed impressive, encompassing not only ornamental gardening but sophisticated understanding of medicinal plant chemistry that went far beyond casual hobbyist interest. "Your conservatory is quite remarkable," Miss Marple mentioned with apparent casualness. "Such rare specimens and so carefully maintained. The digitalis varieties in particular show extraordinary cultivation skills." Mrs. Blackwood's reaction was immediate and defensive, a sharp contrast to her previous proud discussions of her botanical achievements during garden society meetings. "Those are merely common garden plants," she insisted with transparent desperation. "Anyone can grow foxgloves with proper attention to basic soil conditions and watering schedules." The contradiction was glaring to anyone who had heard her previous detailed lectures about alkaloid content variations between different digitalis subspecies and optimal extraction timing for maximum potency. Her Sudden claim of amateur status suggested a frantic attempt to distance herself from any connection to the sophisticated poison that had killed Cynthia. The timeline clarifies. Inspector Slack's methodical investigation had meanwhile established crucial details about the London theatrical contract that provided the final pieces of the timeline puzzle. The agency confirmed that the original offer had been sent 10 days before the fate. The rejection telegram bearing distinctively old-fashioned handwriting had been sent at precisely 10:47 a.m. on the morning of the murder, and Cynthia's frantic telephone call attempting to retract the refusal had come at 3:15 p.m., just over an hour before her body was discovered in the oak coffin. This timeline confirmed that Cynthia had only learned of the sabotage late in the afternoon, likely when she finally managed to contact the London agency directly. Her argument with Dr. Thornfield by the jam tent had probably concerned not just their relationship, but her desperate attempt to salvage the professional opportunity that someone had deliberately destroyed in her name. The precision required to coordinate this deception, intercepting correspondence, forging responses, preparing poison, transporting wedding attire, substituting coffins, and timing the dramatic discovery, spoke of meticulous planning by someone with intimate knowledge of all participants' schedules and habits. The moral crusade revealed. As psychological pressure mounted throughout the day, Mrs. Blackwood's carefully controlled facade began to crumble, revealing the passionate moral crusader who had appointed herself guardian of St. Mary Mead's traditional values. Her condemnation of modern attitudes became increasingly fervent, focusing particularly on young women who abandoned what she considered proper feminine roles for theatrical careers and independent thinking. "The infection spreads through our community like a moral disease," she declared to Miss Marple with evangelical intensity during their afternoon encounter near the church. First, it was Cynthia with her London ideas and rejection of proper feminine behavior, but the corruption continues to influence other young women who begin questioning their elders and abandoning the customs that have sustained our community for generations. Miss Marple observed the present tense of these condemnations with particular interest. Mrs. Blackwood's moral campaign had clearly not ended with Cynthia's death, but remained an active motivation for continued vigilance against those she perceived as threats to traditional virtue and community stability. The staging's true purpose. The elaborate theatrical presentation of Cynthia's death now appeared in its proper context, not merely as concealment of murder, but as an elaborate morality play designed to demonstrate the ultimate consequences of rejecting established customs. By presenting Cynthia in death as the traditional sleeping bride, adorned in antique family heirlooms and surrounded by the trappings of old-fashioned feminine virtue, Mrs. Blackwood had sought to impose her own narrative even in death. The orange blossom perfume, the antique lace veil, the carefully arranged wedding costume, all were elements of this grotesque symbolic reclamation, forcing Cynthia to embody in death the very traditions she had allegedly scorned in life. It was moral theater, written in blood and staged with flowers, where someone had appointed themselves both director and final arbiter of community values. Miss Marple's final preparation. As evening approached and the various threads of evidence wove together into an inescapable pattern, Miss Marple made her final preparations for the confrontation she knew must come. Her gentle suggestion about Thursday's tea at the church hall had been carefully calculated to create the perfect setting for exposing Mrs. Blackwood's elaborate deception. The mention of certain items and physical evidence would gnaw at the killer's consciousness, forcing her to choose between maintaining her facade of innocent cooperation or revealing the desperate need to control information that could destroy her carefully constructed narrative of moral authority. Miss Marple reflected on the psychology that could transform community celebration into a stage for murder, understanding that Mrs. Blackwood's crime represented more than simple elimination of a perceived threat. It was an attempt to rewrite the narrative of modern life itself, using death as the ultimate argument for the supremacy of tradition over progress, propriety over independence, and her own moral vision over the victim's personal choices. The heritage fate had indeed showcased tradition, but not the charming customs Mrs. Blackwood had intended to celebrate. Instead, it had revealed the dangerous intersection of moral certainty, sophisticated knowledge, and the particular vanity that could justify any action in service of what the killer perceived as virtue. Tomorrow's tea would provide the stage for the final act of this tragic drama, where Miss Marple would gently but ruthlessly expose the full extent of the deception that had transformed St. Mary Mead's peaceful celebration into a theatre for murder. As the church clock struck 9 and an uneasy quiet settled over the village, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with the steady rhythm of someone whose understanding of human nature had once again proven both accurate and deeply troubling. The bride who had slept in the wrong coffin would soon have justice, though the revelation of truth would bring its own form of tragedy to a community that had harbored such deadly moral fanaticism beneath its placid surface. Thursday's afternoon tea at the church hall carried the deceptive tranquility that Miss Marple had come to recognize as the calm before revelation. The familiar ritual of china cups and cucumber sandwiches proceeded with village precision, yet beneath the surface civility. An undeniable tension hummed through the gathering like electricity before a storm. She had positioned herself strategically near the window, where the afternoon light fell gently across her knitting, while allowing her to observe every participant with the practiced eye of someone who understood that truth often revealed itself in the smallest gestures. The strategic display. Miss Marple had arranged for several items to be placed casually on a side table, not as official evidence, but as seemingly innocent reminders of the fete preparations. A length of white ribbon, tied in the distinctive leftover right pattern that had caught her attention, sat beside a small bottle of orange blossom perfume and a delicate piece of antique lace, similar to the veil found with Cynthia's body. To the casual observer, these appeared to be mere remnants of the tragic celebration, but Miss Marple understood their power as psychological triggers for someone whose carefully constructed facade was beginning to show cracks. Mrs. Blackwood moved through the gathering with her characteristic air of authority, yet Miss Marple noted the subtle changes in her behavior, the way her eyes repeatedly darted toward the display table, the slight tremor in her hands when she poured tea, and the careful distance she maintained from Inspector Slack, who had positioned himself where he could observe the entire room. The gentle pressure begins. Such attention to detail in all our village preparations, Miss Marple remarked to the gathering, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she spoke. I was particularly impressed by the historical accuracy of the fete displays. The proper funeral ribbons, the authentic perfumes, even the precise botanical knowledge required for such realistic period demonstrations. She lifted the small bottle from the table, examining it with apparent casual interest. Orange blossom. Such an old-fashioned choice for a bride's perfume. My dear mother always said it represented purity and traditional values, though I understand it was found rather mysteriously in Mrs. Hartwell's spare room, unkept and spilled on the morning of the tragedy. Mrs. Blackwood's reaction was immediate and telling. Her teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer, and she cleared her throat with forced lightness. I'm sure many of us use such traditional sense for historical accuracy, she said, though her voice carried a slight strain that betrayed her composure. The handwriting revelation Inspector Slack, following Miss Marple's subtle orchestration, chose this moment to contribute his official observations. We've been particularly interested in the correspondence aspects of this case, he announced, consulting his notebook with deliberate precision. The telegram sent to London refusing Miss Hartwell's theatrical contract, for instance. The handwriting analysis has proven quite illuminating. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers working the delicate stitches of her knitting. Handwriting is such a revealing thing, don't you think? One can disguise it temporarily, but certain habits persist. The way someone forms particular letters, the spacing between words, the natural rhythm of the pen. I once knew a lady who could never write quickly because she lifted her pen before crossing every T, creating those distinctive floating dashes that marked all her correspondence. The color drained from Mrs. Blackwood's face as the implications became clear. Her carefully maintained composure began to show more significant cracks as she realized that her meticulous penmanship, the same precise, old-fashioned style she had used for years in church correspondence, had betrayed her involvement in the deception. The botanical knowledge exposed Dr. Haydock, who had arrived to provide his professional perspective, added another layer to the mounting evidence. The digitalis preparation was remarkably sophisticated, he observed, stirring his tea with clinical precision. Whoever created it possessed extensive knowledge of alkaloid extraction, the kind of expertise that requires formal training or years of dedicated botanical study. Mrs. Blackwood's defensive response was swift and desperate. Surely any serious gardener might know something about common plants, she protested, though her voice carried the hollow ring of someone whose carefully constructed defenses were collapsing. One reads about such things in horticultural journals. Miss Marple's gentle observation cut through this pretense like a blade through silk. Indeed, though your conservatory suggests knowledge far beyond casual reading, such rare digitalis varieties, such sophisticated extraction equipment, it speaks of someone with genuine pharmaceutical expertise. The physical evidence confronts. The moment Miss Marple had been orchestrating arrived when she lifted the ribbon from the display table, examining its distinctive knot with apparent curiosity. "Such an interesting tying technique," she murmured. Mr. Sedgwick was quite specific about proper funeral ribbons being tied right over left. Yet this one shows the reverse pattern. A natural mistake for someone left-handed, perhaps, or someone not formally trained in mortuary customs. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes fixed on the ribbon with obvious alarm, her left hand unconsciously clenching as she recognized the evidence of her own handiwork. The careful precision that had characterized her planning was now betraying her through the very attention to detail she had thought would ensure success. "And the green chalk dust," Miss Marple continued with deceptive mildness, "found on the brass fittings and inside that curious hat box Mr. Plummet observed being carried near the churchyard. Such distinctive traces, linking the theatrical coffin's marking system to the oak casket where poor Cynthia was discovered. The psychological breakdown. The accumulated pressure of evidence, observation, and gentle questioning finally achieved its intended effect. Mrs. Blackwood's composure, maintained through days of investigation and mounting suspicion, began to crumble visibly. Her breathing became shallow, her hands trembled as she set down her teacup, and her eyes darted around the room like those of a trapped animal seeking escape. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising with desperate intensity as the facade of community leader gave way to the passionate moral crusader beneath. Cynthia represented everything corrupt about the modern world, the rejection of proper feminine virtue, the abandonment of community values, the influence that was poisoning other young women with ideas of independence and theatrical careers. Miss Marple observed this transformation with the careful attention of someone who had witnessed such psychological revelations many times before. The shift from denial to justification marked the crucial moment when the killer's elaborate construction of moral authority finally collapsed under the weight of inexorable truth. The complete confession. As the afternoon light streamed through the church hall windows, casting gentle shadows across a scene transformed from civilized gathering to moral reckoning, Mrs. Blackwood's complete confession emerged with the force of truth finally released from its constraints. Her interception of Cynthia's correspondence, her preparation of the digitalis poison, her elaborate staging of the death scene, all had been motivated by a genuine belief that she was protecting St. Mary Mead from spiritual corruption. "I gave her the honor in death that she refused in life," Mrs. Blackwood declared with the fervor of someone who genuinely believed her actions had served virtue. She became the sleeping bride she should have been willingly, surrounded by the traditions she scorned, wearing the symbols of proper feminine behavior she had rejected. The revelation brought its own form of tragedy to the gathered villagers who realized they had harbored such deadly moral fanaticism beneath their community's placid surface. As Inspector Slack began the formal process of arrest, Miss Marple reflected on how the heritage fete had indeed showcased tradition, not the charming customs Mrs. Blackwood had intended to celebrate, but the timeless human capacity for moral certainty to justify the most terrible actions. The aftermath. The church hall fell into stunned silence as the full implications of Mrs. Blackwood's confession settled over the gathering. The woman who had appointed herself guardian of village virtue, who had organized countless community celebrations and moral improvement societies, had transformed their peaceful celebration into a stage for murder through her twisted interpretation of traditional values. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with steady fingers, though her heart was heavy with the knowledge that the bride who had slept in the wrong coffin would finally have justice. The mystery was solved, but at the cost of revealing how easily moral authority could mask the most dangerous forms of fanaticism, and how the desire to preserve tradition could become a justification for the ultimate violation of community trust. As Inspector Slack led Mrs. Blackwood away, and the villagers began to disperse in shocked whispers, Miss Marple reflected on the particular tragedy of crimes committed in the name of virtue. How they corrupted not just the perpetrator, but the very values they claimed to protect, leaving communities to rebuild both their sense of safety and their faith in the moral foundations they had thought unshakable. The silence that followed Mrs. Blackwood's confession stretched across the church hall like a taut wire, broken only by the soft clink of teacups settling into saucers as hands trembled with the shock of revelation. Inspector Slack moved forward with the measured precision of someone whose professional training had prepared him for such moments. Yet his eyes betrayed the deep unease that came from witnessing moral certainty transformed into murderous fanaticism before an entire community. "Mrs. Honoria Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the formal weight of legal procedure, "I'm arresting you for the murder of Cynthia Hartwell and the attempted murder of Mrs. Millicent Hartwell. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." Mrs. Blackwood's response was immediate and chilling in its complete lack of remorse. "Evidence," she repeated, her voice rising with the fervor of someone whose moral crusade had finally found its public platform. "The evidence is all around you. The corruption of traditional values, the abandonment of proper feminine behavior, the infection of modern ideas that threatens the very foundation of communities like ours. I acted to preserve what is sacred and proper." Miss Marple observed this final revelation with the careful attention she had devoted to every aspect of the case. Mrs. Blackwood's complete inability to recognize the criminality of her actions confirmed what the gentle detective had suspected from the beginning. They were dealing with someone whose moral fanaticism had progressed beyond rational thought into genuine delusion. The elaborate staging of Cynthia's death had not been merely theatrical. It had been evangelical, designed to convert through horror what persuasion had failed to achieve. Dr. Thornfield, who had remained silent throughout the confession, finally spoke with a voice hollow with grief and disbelief. "You killed her because she wanted to return to London, because she chose independence over the life you thought she should live." "I killed no one," Mrs. Blackwood replied with the terrifying conviction of someone who had redefined murder as moral instruction. "I provided Cynthia with the traditional death she should have chosen willingly, surrounded by the symbols of proper feminine virtue, wearing the ancestral lace that connected her to generations of women who understood their proper place in society. She became in death what she refused to be in life." The psychological complexity of this justification struck Miss Marple as particularly revealing. Mrs. Blackwood had not simply eliminated someone who threatened her worldview. She had attempted to rewrite the narrative of Cynthia's entire existence, forcing her to embody in death the very traditions she had rejected in life. It was moral theatre, written in blood and staged with flowers, where the killer had appointed herself both director and final arbiter of community values. As Inspector Slack began the formal procedures, additional details of Mrs. Blackwood's elaborate deception continued to emerge. Her interception of Cynthia's correspondence had been systematic and calculating, involving not only the theft of the theatrical contract, but the forging of responses that would effectively destroy the young woman's professional prospects. The false telegram refusing the London role had been sent with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized every aspect of her crime. Young Tom Sedgwick, still pale from his shock at being used as an unwitting accomplice, provided additional testimony about Mrs. Blackwood's manipulation of the fete preparations. "She knew exactly when everyone would be where," he said quietly to Miss Marple as the arrest proceedings continued. She'd been planning it for weeks, asking questions about schedules and routines like she was just being helpful with the organization. The attempted poisoning of Mrs. Hartwell now appeared in its proper context as part of Mrs. Blackwood's broader campaign to eliminate anyone who might threaten her carefully constructed narrative. The bereaved aunt's potential memories of unusual morning activities and her intimate knowledge of household routines had made her a dangerous witness whose elimination seemed necessary to preserve the killer's facade of innocent community leadership. Dr. Haydock, who had arrived to provide medical support if needed, confirmed the sophisticated nature of the digitalis preparation that had killed Cynthia. "This wasn't amateur experimentation," he observed grimly to Inspector Slack. "The extraction was professionally done, the dosage calculated precisely, and the masking agents chosen to render detection difficult. We're dealing with someone whose botanical knowledge extends far beyond casual gardening." Mrs. Blackwood's conservatory, Miss Marple reflected, had indeed been impressive in its scope and sophistication. The extensive collection of medicinal plants, the professional extraction equipment, and the detailed preparation notes all spoke of years of dedicated study, motivated not by healing, but by the desire to possess ultimate power over life and death in service of her moral crusade. As the evening shadows lengthened and Mrs. Blackwood was led away, still proclaiming her righteousness to anyone who would listen, the villagers began to disperse in small, subdued groups. The revelation that their community's moral guardian had been capable of such calculated cruelty forced a painful re-examination of how they identified and trusted their leaders. Miss Marple remained in the church hall after the others had gone, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm as she reflected on the particular tragedy of crimes committed in the name of virtue. In her extensive experience with human nature, she had observed that the most dangerous criminals were often those who genuinely believed their actions served higher purposes, for they possessed both the conviction to plan meticulously and the self-righteousness to justify any means in service of their perceived ends. The Heritage Fate's transformation from celebration to crime scene now appeared as the inevitable result of Mrs. Blackwood's psychological need to control every aspect of community life. Her elaborate staging of Cynthia's death had been designed not merely to conceal murder, but to create a lasting monument to her own moral vision. A grotesque tableau that would serve as perpetual reminder of what befell those who rejected traditional feminine virtue and community values. The antique lace veil, the orange blossom perfume, and the carefully arranged wedding costume had all been elements of this macabre reclamation project. It was moral theatre of the most twisted kind, where personal tragedy had been transformed into public lesson with the calculated precision of someone who viewed murder as education. As the church clock struck 8 and an uneasy quiet settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return home. The bride who had slept in the wrong coffin would finally rest in peace, though the community she had left behind would long struggle with the knowledge that their peaceful village had harbored such deadly moral fanaticism beneath its placid surface. The mystery was solved, but its resolution brought no simple satisfaction, only the complex understanding that truth, while necessary, could not undo the damage wrought by someone who had transformed love of tradition into justification for murder, and who had used the very institutions meant to preserve community values as instruments of personal vengeance against those who dared to embrace a more modern vision of feminine independence and moral autonomy. Tomorrow would bring the formal legal proceedings and the beginning of St. Mary Mead's long process of healing, but tonight belonged to reflection on how easily moral authority could mask the most dangerous forms of fanaticism, and how the desire to preserve tradition could become a weapon against the very community it claimed to protect. The morning after Mrs. Blackwood's arrest brought an oppressive quiet to St. Mary Mead that seemed to muffle even the familiar sounds of village life. Miss Marple, rising at her customary early hour, observed from her bedroom window how the tragedy had fundamentally altered the rhythms of their small community. The milk cart moved more cautiously than usual. Conversations at garden gates were conducted in hushed tones, and even the sparrows seemed subdued in their morning chorus, as if nature itself had absorbed the shock of revelation. Inspector Slack had returned to Much Benham with his prisoner, but the formal legal machinery that would eventually bring Mrs. Blackwood to trial moved with deliberate slowness that left the village suspended in an uncomfortable limbo between shock and acceptance. The evidence was overwhelming. The handwriting analysis, the botanical preparations, the physical traces connecting her to every aspect of the elaborate crime. Yet the community struggled to reconcile the woman they had trusted with moral leadership with the calculating killer who had transformed their celebration into a stage for murder. The scope of deception revealed. Miss Marple's morning constitutional led her past the post office, where young Peggy Barnes was sorting mail with obvious anxiety. The girl's revelations about the systematic interception of correspondence painted a picture of deception far more extensive than anyone had initially imagined. She always volunteered to help with the Morning Post, Peggy explained, her voice carrying the guilt of someone who realized their innocent cooperation had facilitated murder. Said it was community service, helping Mrs. Pemberton with the heavier loads. I never thought to question why she was always so interested in certain addresses or particular correspondence. The revelation cast Mrs. Blackwood's extensive volunteer work in an entirely different light. Her involvement in virtually every aspect of village life, from church committees to social organizations to charitable activities, had provided her with unprecedented access to private information and community secrets. What had appeared as admirable civic dedication had actually been systematic intelligence gathering in service of her moral crusade against those she deemed threats to traditional values. Mr. Sedgwick, still struggling with the professional humiliation of having his finest casket used as a prop for murder, provided additional insight into the killer's meticulous planning. His detailed examination of the funeral preparations revealed that Mrs. Blackwood had manipulated every aspect of the display arrangements, from the positioning of the coffins to the scheduling of access periods when the substitution could be made without observation. She knew exactly when young Tom would be away oiling hinges, he reported with obvious distress. She'd asked specific questions about our preparation schedule, claiming she wanted to coordinate the pageant timing perfectly. I thought it was just her usual attention to detail, not reconnaissance for murder. Personal devastation and community impact. Dr. Thornfield emerged from his surgery as Miss Marple passed, his appearance bearing the unmistakable marks of sleepless nights and profound grief. The revelation that Cynthia's death had been orchestrated by someone they had all trusted as a pillar of moral authority had added layers of betrayal and guilt to his already overwhelming loss. I keep thinking about the signs I might have missed, he said quietly, his medical training warring with his emotional devastation. Mrs. Blackwood was always so concerned about proper behavior, so insistent on traditional values. I thought it was merely old-fashioned strictness, not the kind of fanaticism that could justify murder. Miss Marple paused in her knitting to offer the gentle wisdom that came from decades of observing human nature in all its complexity. In my experience, Doctor, the most dangerous people are often those who appear most virtuous on the surface. Mrs. Blackwood genuinely believed she was protecting the community from moral corruption. That conviction gave her the strength to plan meticulously and the self-righteousness to justify any action in service of what she perceived as virtue. Mrs. Hartwell, whose narrow escape from the second poisoning attempt had left her shaken but determined to understand the full scope of the deception, joined their conversation with obvious distress. The spare room key was always kept in the same place where everyone in the family knew to find it. I never imagined that familiarity could be used against us so deliberately. Mrs. Blackwood had been in our home countless times for committee meetings and social calls. She knew our routines, our schedules, even where we kept our family treasures. The violation of domestic trust represented perhaps the most personal aspect of Mrs. Blackwood's betrayal. She had not simply committed murder, she had perverted the very foundations of community life, transforming hospitality into vulnerability and social connection into criminal opportunity. The moral theater exposed. As the day progressed, the full psychological complexity of Mrs. Blackwood's crime became increasingly apparent. Miss Marple reflected on how the elaborate staging of Cynthia's death had been designed not merely to conceal murder, but to create a lasting monument to the killer's moral vision, a grotesque tableau that would serve as perpetual reminder of what befell those who rejected established feminine virtue and community values. The orange blossom perfume, the antique lace veil, and the carefully arranged wedding costume had all been elements of this macabre reclamation project. Mrs. Blackwood had not simply murdered someone who threatened her worldview. She had attempted to rewrite the narrative of Cynthia's entire existence, forcing her to embody in death the very traditions she had rejected in life. It was moral theater, written in blood and staged with flowers, where someone had appointed themselves both director and final arbiter of community values. The attempted poisoning of Mrs. Hartwell now appeared as part of this broader campaign to eliminate anyone whose survival might threaten the carefully constructed narrative of moral authority. The bereaved aunt's intimate knowledge of household routines and her potential memories of unusual morning activities had made her a dangerous witness whose elimination seemed necessary to preserve the killer's facade of innocent community leadership. Community reckoning. As afternoon approached, the village began the slow process of returning to some semblance of normal routine, though the fundamental changes were already apparent. The revelation that their moral guardian had been capable of such calculated cruelty was forcing a painful re-examination of how they identified and trusted their leaders, while the knowledge that murder had been planned and executed in their midst challenged their fundamental sense of safety and security. Workmen were dismantling the remnants of the heritage fete, their methodical removal of bunting and displays serving as a physical metaphor for the community's need to dismantle the assumptions that had made such deception possible. The display area where the coffins had stood remained cordoned off with official tape that fluttered in the afternoon breeze like a memorial to innocence lost. Miss Marple positioned herself in her garden where she could observe the subtle changes in community dynamics that tragedy always brought. Neighbors spoke in smaller groups, their conversations more guarded, their trust more carefully distributed. The easy familiarity that had characterized village life was being replaced by a more cautious awareness of human complexity and the potential for darkness to hide behind the most respectable facades. Philosophical reflections. As evening approached and the church clock struck 9, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, allowing the complete pattern of the case to settle in her mind. The heritage fate's transformation from celebration to crime scene now appeared as the inevitable result of Mrs. Blackwood's psychological need to control every aspect of community life. her elaborate orchestration of death designed to teach a lesson that only she believed the community needed to learn. The bride who had slept in the wrong coffin would soon rest in proper peace, but the community she had left behind faced the long process of healing from the knowledge that their peaceful village had harbored such deadly moral fanaticism beneath its placid surface. The mystery was solved, but its resolution brought the complex understanding that truth, while necessary, could not undo the damage wrought by someone who had transformed love of tradition into justification for murder. Miss Marple understood that St. Mary Mead would never quite be the same. The charming facade of peaceful English life had been irrevocably altered, revealing the hidden resentments and the capacity for moral certainty to become moral blindness. Yet in her extensive experience with human nature, she knew that communities possessed remarkable resilience, and that from this tragedy might come a deeper, more honest understanding of the complexities that lay beneath the surface of even the most tranquil village life. Tomorrow would bring the formal legal proceedings and the beginning of the community's long journey toward healing. But tonight belonged to reflection on how easily moral authority could mask the most dangerous forms of fanaticism, and how the desire to preserve tradition could become a weapon against the very values it claimed to protect. The Heritage Fete had indeed showcased tradition, but not the charming customs Mrs. Blackwood had intended to celebrate. Instead, it had revealed the timeless human capacity for self-righteousness to justify the most terrible actions, and the eternal need for vigilance against those who would impose their vision of virtue through violence. The morning after Mrs. Blackwood's arrest brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's door with the measured tread of a man whose professional satisfaction was tempered by the sobering nature of his discoveries. The village beyond her garden gate had settled into an uneasy quiet, where even the familiar sounds of daily life seemed muffled by the weight of revelation. The milk cart moved more cautiously than usual, and conversations at garden gates carried a new, guarded quality that spoke of trust fundamentally altered. "We've had Dr. Haydock's final report," Inspector Slack announced as Miss Marple poured him tea in her sitting room. "The timeline's been refined. Death occurred between 11:30 and 1:30 in the afternoon, which fits perfectly with your observations about the damp grass and the beer house preparations." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. It seemed more likely that poor Cynthia died where she would next be needed. The beer house provided privacy, a suitable work surface, and very little foot traffic during the fete preparations, particularly after young Tom had so helpfully left the door propped open to dry. The inspector consulted his notes with grim precision. "We've traced the hat box to the church's costume collection and found exactly the green chalk residue you predicted along the rim. Mrs. Blackwood used it to transport the wedding dress and veil, along with something else, a sweet drink laced with digitalis. She framed the poison as kindness, a restorative for a nervous bride about to perform in the pageant. Digitalis is terribly bitter," Miss Marple observed gently, "but sugar syrups can mask almost anything unpleasant. I noticed an abandoned spoon by the jam tent and later found a sticky rim on a small bottle in the beer house, faintly scented with orange blossom from her morning preparations in Mrs. Hartwell's spare room." Inspector Slack's expression darkened as he continued. The conservatory search revealed far more than botanical expertise. Mrs. Blackwood had been maintaining detailed surveillance files on various village residents, notes about their habits, relationships, and what she considered moral failings. Miss Hartwell wasn't her only intended target, merely the first whose behavior had reached what she deemed an intolerable level of corruption. This revelation sent a chill through Miss Marple's understanding of the case's true scope. Mrs. Blackwood had not simply committed murder in a moment of moral outrage. She had appointed herself as systematic arbiter of community virtue, maintaining records and planning potential eliminations with the methodical precision of someone who genuinely believed elimination could serve as moral instruction. The community's gradual healing. As the weeks passed and autumn began to paint the village in gentler hues, Miss Marple observed the subtle but profound changes that tragedy had wrought upon St. Mary Mead. The easy familiarity that had characterized village life was being replaced by a more cautious awareness of human complexity and the potential for darkness to hide behind even the most respectable facades. Dr. Thornfield had gradually resumed his practice, though those who knew him well could see the permanent changes that grief and betrayal had carved into his character. During one of Miss Marple's visits to his surgery, he confided with hollow honesty, "I keep wondering what other signs I missed. Mrs. Blackwood was always so concerned about proper behavior, so insistent on traditional values. Looking back, I can see how her questions about my relationship with Cynthia were not merely social interest, but intelligence gathering for her moral crusade." Young Peggy Barnes at the post office carried a different burden entirely. "If I had spoken up sooner about the signature," she whispered to Miss Marple with the fierce guilt of youth, "if I had told the inspector that very morning about the handwriting differences." "My dear," Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness, "if good people could foresee evil with perfect clarity, there would be very little of either in the world. You did speak when it mattered, and your observations helped save a second life. That is no small achievement." Mrs. Hartwell had eventually moved away from the cottage where so many painful memories lingered, though she maintained her connections to the community with quiet determination. The attempted poisoning had left her understandably wary, but she refused to allow Mrs. Blackwood's actions to completely destroy her faith in human goodness. The broader implications. As the legal proceedings moved forward with inevitable precision, each new revelation added another layer to the community's understanding of how thoroughly they had been deceived. Mrs. Blackwood's extensive volunteer work, her knowledge of local customs, and her passionate advocacy for traditional values had created a facade that concealed dangerous fanaticism until it was too late to prevent tragedy. The Heritage Fete grounds had been restored to their peaceful state, but the memory lingered in ways both subtle and profound. The vicar had quietly decided against similar celebrations for the foreseeable future, recognizing that the community needed time to heal before attempting to recreate the kind of gathering that had been so thoroughly corrupted by elaborate moral theater. Miss Marple reflected on the psychological profile that had emerged from the investigation. Mrs. Blackwood's crime represented more than simple elimination of a perceived threat. It was an attempt to rewrite the narrative of modern life itself, using death as the ultimate argument for the supremacy of tradition over progress, propriety over independence, and her own moral vision over individual choice. Miss Marple's final understanding. As autumn deepened and the anniversary of the tragedy approached, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the complete pattern that had transformed their peaceful celebration into a stage for murder. The case had revealed not only the capacity for moral fanaticism to justify terrible actions, but also the vulnerability of communities that placed too much trust in outward appearances of virtue and respectability. Sitting in her garden on a crisp October evening, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic steady rhythm, she reflected on the enduring lessons St. Mary Mead had learned through such painful experience. People, she mused, were rather like old tapestries, beautiful and intricate on the surface, but woven with countless hidden threads, some strong and bright, others tangled and dark. The challenge lay in discerning the pattern, in understanding how those hidden threads could suddenly unravel to reveal unexpected truths lurking beneath. The bride, who had slept in the wrong coffin, had finally been laid to rest with proper ceremony, her grave bearing a simple inscription chosen by Mrs. Hartwell. She lived as she chose, and died as she was loved. It served as a quiet rebuke to Mrs. Blackwood's attempt to impose her narrative even in death, and as a reminder that individual choice and personal freedom remained precious precisely because they were vulnerable to those who would eliminate them in service of ideological purity. the enduring legacy. The trial, when it commenced, would reveal the full scope of Mrs. Blackwood's moral crusade and fascinate legal scholars with its demonstration of how sophisticated planning could serve the most twisted psychological purposes. But for Miss Marple, the true resolution lay not in legal proceedings, but in the wisdom gained through community suffering. St. Mary Mead had learned to look more carefully beneath the surface of respectability, to question the motives of those who claimed moral authority, and to protect the vulnerable from those who would eliminate them in service of their vision of virtue. The village would never again be quite so trusting or naive about the potential for darkness to hide behind respectable facades, and perhaps that knowledge, painful though it was, would serve as protection against future tragedies. As the church clock struck 9 and an autumn wind rustled through the leaves of the ancient chestnut tree, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to her cottage. Tomorrow she would visit Mrs. Henderson with a finished baby jacket, suggest to Mrs. Hartwell's replacement that spare room keys be kept somewhere less obvious, and perhaps recommend to the vicar's wife that next year's community celebration focus on something as innocent as hedgerow jams, with carefully accurate labels, of course. The heritage fete had indeed showcased tradition, but not the charming customs Mrs. Blackwood had intended to celebrate. Instead, it had revealed the eternal truth that the most dangerous individuals were often those who saw themselves as unequivocally virtuous, and that vigilance against such moral certainty remained one of humanity's most necessary skills. The bride who had slept in the wrong coffin had taught St. Mary Mead lessons about tolerance, community, and the true meaning of virtue that no pageant could have provided, though the price of that education had been far too high. In the end, Miss Marple understood. The mystery had been solved not through forensic brilliance, but through patient observation of human nature in all its fascinating, troubling complexity. And somewhere in England, she knew, other communities were learning similar lessons about the delicate balance between preserving tradition and protecting the freedom of those who chose to live by their own moral compass, rather than submit to the rigid certainties of self-appointed guardians of virtue. Inspector Slack returned to St. Mary Mead 3 weeks after Mrs. Blackwood's arrest, carrying with him the satisfied air of a man whose case had been thoroughly concluded, yet still troubled by certain technical details that nagged at his methodical mind. He found Miss Marple in her garden, carefully tying back late roses against the approaching autumn winds, and accepted her invitation for tea with an almost companionable gratitude. "There are just 2 small points that won't let me rest easy," he began without preamble, settling into the offered garden chair. "First, Sedgwick swears he kept that coffin key with him throughout the day. Second, your little exhibition at the church hall tea. You won't tell me you actually had the real evidence on that table, will you?" Miss Marple paused in her work with the roses, brushing a few stray petals from her gardening gloves before settling back with a gentle smile. "Oh no, Inspector. Your evidence remains safely in official hands, as it should. I simply arranged a length of ribbon from my own mending basket and filled one of my mother's old cologne bottles with nothing more sinister than orange flower water for cake flavoring. You see, people who are comfortable in their innocence don't mind the sight of ordinary objects, but a guilty person puts meaning into things quite without our assistance." Inspector Slack gave a short laugh that acknowledged both the cleverness and the audacity of her strategy. "So you tied that bow left over right yourself, knowing it would trigger her response?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied placidly, after observing at the fete that the knot on the oak coffin had been tied in precisely that manner by someone who clearly wasn't Mr. Sedgwick. "It's the small habits that betray us. Handedness, the way one forms letters or ties ribbons." "And the key?" Slack pressed, consulting his notebook. "Mr. Sedgwick is a most conscientious man, but like all of us, he's a creature of habit. He pats his pocket for reassurance, then, being momentarily distracted by his duties, sets a thing down just for a moment. Young Tom, with his green chalk, had been moving constantly between the beer house and the display area. That little smear of chalk dust on the oak coffin's interior told me the lid had been opened by chalky fingers well before Colonel Weatherby's dramatic discovery. Mr. Sedgwick eventually admitted, rather reluctantly, that he had placed the key on the trestle table while adjusting the funeral pall. Mrs. Blackwood, always eager to be helpful, simply retrieved it, completed her grim arrangement, and returned the key to exactly where he would expect to find it. A tidy woman, even about the most untidy business imaginable. The inspector nodded with grim satisfaction. It matches what we found during the detailed search. A cork ring from a syrup bottle under the beer house shelf, still sticky with sugar residue. Orange blossom traces on both Cynthia's veil and inside a small tumbler left there. She administered her restorative, where it could be managed quietly, and, in her twisted way, kindly. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the lane where autumn hedges were beginning to show their first touches of gold. That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect to understand, Inspector. It would be simpler if we could dismiss her as a monster and be finished with it. But Mrs. Blackwood was genuinely capable of kindness when it served her notion of proper order. In different circumstances, she might have bound up wounds with the same meticulous care she later devoted to mixing her poisons. The trial and its revelations. When Mrs. Blackwood's trial commenced at the county courthouse in Much Benham, it drew attention far beyond the boundaries of their small village. Miss Marple attended as a key witness, observing with her characteristic attention to human nature how the defendant maintained her dignified composure throughout the proceedings, showing not a trace of remorse, but rather the serene confidence of someone who genuinely believed truth would vindicate her actions. The evidence unfolded with methodical precision. Dr. Haydock's testimony about the sophisticated digitalist preparation, the handwriting expert's analysis of forged correspondence, young Peggy Barnes' nervous but crucial observations about intercepted mail. Each piece built upon the last to create an inescapable pattern of premeditation and elaborate moral theater. Most chilling was Mrs. Blackwood's own testimony, delivered with evangelical fervor about protecting the community from corruption and preserving traditional feminine virtue. Her complete inability to recognize the criminality of her actions, combined with her passionate conviction that murder could serve as moral instruction, provided the jury with a disturbing glimpse into fanaticism disguised as respectability. The verdict, when it came, was swift and unanimous. Yet as Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead in the gathering November dusk, she reflected that legal resolution, however necessary, could not undo the fundamental changes the case had wrought upon their community. The village transformed. In the month that followed, St. Mary Mead settled into a different rhythm of life. More cautious, perhaps, but also more honest about the complexities that could lurk beneath even the most tranquil surface. The annual Heritage Fete was quietly postponed indefinitely, the vicar citing a community need for reflection and healing that everyone understood without explanation. Dr. Thornfield gradually resumed his full practice, though those who knew him well could observe the permanent changes that grief and betrayal had carved into his character. During one of Miss Marple's visits to his surgery, he confided with hollow honesty, "I find myself questioning everything I thought I knew about reading character." Mrs. Blackwood's concern for proper behavior seemed so admirable until it became justification for murder. Young Peggy Barnes had transformed from a shy postal clerk into a sharp-eyed guardian of community communication, her earlier guilt about not speaking sooner replaced by fierce determination to notice and report anything amiss. Her attention to detail, once dismissed as mere curiosity, was now respected as a valuable community asset. Mr. Sedgwick, with grave patience, taught young Tom the proper technique for funeral ribbons. Right over left, never the reverse, explaining not just the method, but the respect it represented for those who found comfort in such traditions. The lesson carried deeper meaning now, about the difference between preserving customs through love and imposing them through force. Roderick Ashworth, after walking for weeks under the weight of suspicion and self-doubt, made the decision to lease Ashworth Hall and accept a position with a shipping firm in Bristol. He had learned, he told Miss Marple before departing, that old stones were less demanding when one didn't live perpetually in their shadow. Miss Marple's final understanding. As winter settled over the village and the first anniversary of the tragedy approached, Miss Marple often found herself contemplating the complete pattern that had emerged from their painful experience. Sitting in her parlour with her knitting, she reflected on how Mrs. Blackwood's elaborate crime had revealed not just individual fanaticism, but the vulnerability of communities that place too much trust in outward appearances of virtue. The case had demonstrated how easily moral authority could mask dangerous certainty, how systematic surveillance could masquerade as community involvement, and how the desire to preserve tradition could become a weapon against those who chose to live by different values. Mrs. Blackwood had not simply committed murder. She had attempted to rewrite the narrative of modern life itself, using death as her ultimate argument for the supremacy of her rigid moral vision. The heritage fete had indeed showcased tradition, but not the charming customs originally intended. Instead, it had revealed the eternal human capacity for self-righteousness to justify terrible actions, and the constant vigilance required to protect communities from those who would impose their vision of virtue through violence. On a crisp December evening, as Miss Marple walked past the churchyard where new rosemary bushes had replaced the foxgloves, for remembrance, as Hodges had explained, and for the kitchen, because a thing is best if it serves two purposes. She paused to reflect on the bride who had slept in the wrong coffin. Cynthia Hartwell's grave bore a simple inscription chosen by her aunt. She lived as she chose and died as she was loved. It served as both memorial and gentle rebuke to those who would impose their narratives on others, a reminder that individual choice and personal freedom remained precious precisely because they were vulnerable to those who would eliminate them in service of ideological purity. The mystery was solved, the killer convicted, but the deeper lessons about human nature would remain with St. Mary Mead always. The village had lost some of its innocence, but gained wisdom about the complexities that lay beneath the surface of even the most peaceful community. They had learned to look more carefully at those who claimed moral authority, to question the motives of self-appointed guardians of virtue, and to protect the vulnerable from those who would sacrifice them on the altar of rigid tradition. As the church clock struck 9 and Miss Marple made her way home through the quiet lanes, she understood that communities, like people, grew stronger through adversity when they chose wisdom over bitterness. St. Mary Mead would never again be quite so trusting or naive, but perhaps that knowledge, painful though it was, would serve as protection against future tragedies born from the dangerous intersection of moral certainty and the power to act upon it. The bride who had slept in the wrong coffin had taught them all lessons about tolerance, community, and the true meaning of virtue that no pageant could have provided. The price of that education had been far too high, but the knowledge gained might yet serve to protect others from similar fates in communities where moral fanaticism learned to hide behind the respectable mask of traditional values. In the end, Miss Marple reflected as she settled by her fireside with her knitting, the mystery had been solved not through forensic brilliance, but through patient observation of human nature in all its fascinating, troubling complexity. And somewhere in England, she knew, other communities were learning similar lessons about the delicate balance between preserving what was valuable from the past while protecting the freedom of those who chose to build something new for the future. The spring that followed Mrs. Blackwood's conviction arrived with a gentleness that seemed to acknowledge both the passage of time and St. Mary Mead's gradual healing from its traumatic experience. Miss Marple, tending her early roses in the same garden where so many revelations had unfolded, observed how the daffodils near Cynthia's grave pushed through the earth with nature's persistent optimism, offering their own quiet lesson about resilience in the face of profound loss. Inspector Slack's final visit came on a warm April morning, carrying both closure documents and news that would mark the end of their ordeal. Mrs. Blackwood died in prison last week, he announced without preamble, settling into the familiar garden chair where so many pieces of the puzzle had been assembled. Natural causes, though the physician noted her complete inability to accept her conviction. She maintained to the very end that she had acted virtuously. Miss Marple paused in her pruning, her gentle eyes reflecting the complex emotions such news inevitably brought. "I cannot say I'm surprised, Inspector. People who live by such rigid moral certainty often find it impossible to survive when their worldview collapses. She genuinely believed she was protecting the community, and when society rejected that belief, she had nothing left to sustain her. The village transformed. In the months since the trial, St. Mary Mead had developed a more sophisticated understanding of the delicate balance between preserving valuable traditions and protecting individual freedom from those who would impose virtue through force. The community had learned to distinguish between genuine moral leadership and the dangerous fanaticism that could masquerade as respectable concern. A thin envelope had arrived from London bearing the letterhead of Vane and Laurier, forwarded to Miss Marple's care by the vicar who feared it might distress Mrs. Hartwell. The theatrical firm, with the practical tenderness of people who understood that talent and timing seldom coincided, offered to establish a modest annual scholarship for village girls to study elocution or music. The donor preferred anonymity, though the firm's careful phrasing revealed there were two contributors. One, writing from Bristol, where Roderick Ashworth had found both employment and peace in being useful rather than merely ornamental. Dr. Thornfield had channeled his grief into expanded service, providing medical care to surrounding villages while carrying the quiet wisdom of someone who had learned to look beyond surface respectability to genuine compassion. His experience with Mrs. Blackwood's deception had taught him that the human heart was capable of both profound love and terrifying delusion, and that recognizing the distinction often came at a terrible cost. Young Peggy Barnes had blossomed from a shy postal clerk into a confident guardian of community communication, her sharp observational skills now valued rather than dismissed. She had started an informal reading group for young women, discussing books that explored themes of independence and choice. A living legacy of Cynthia's tragic fate transformed into protection for others who might face similar pressures to conform. Mr. Sedgwick had taken particular care in training young Tom, emphasizing not just technical skills, but the respect and empathy their profession required. "We will tie properly," he told the boy while teaching him both left-handed and traditional techniques. "But we will not pretend your hands are other than they are." It was a lesson about accommodation rather than rigid conformity that extended far beyond funeral ribbons. Symbolic healing. The physical landscape bore witness to the community's healing process. Hodges had replaced the foxgloves along the church wall with rosemary cuttings, explaining with his characteristic practicality, "For remembrance and for the kitchen too, a thing is best when it serves two purposes." The beer house door had been planed and rehung so it no longer stuck in damp weather, and the green hat box had been returned to its proper place among the costume collection, polished and aired of all unpleasant associations. Mrs. Hartwell, who had found peace in a seaside cottage where waves provided their own rhythm of healing, occasionally wrote to Miss Marple with snippets of her quieter life. She had accepted the scholarship proposal with the observation that Cynthia would have laughed at being anyone's example, but she would have been pleased to make choices easier for other girls. Miss Marple's final understanding. As the first anniversary of the Heritage Fete approached, the village quietly decided to mark the occasion not with memorial services, but with a simple concert in the parish hall. Hymns, a piano duet, perhaps a short recitation if someone could be coaxed to stand up. No pageants, no tableau, no coffins of any kind. The vicar, with characteristic wisdom, limited the decorations to 3 modest swags and suggested that the best memorial would be the community's ongoing commitment to protecting those who might be vulnerable to future moral crusaders. Miss Marple attended this gentle gathering with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed a community grow wiser through adversity. The lessons learned through tragedy had been painful but necessary, teaching St. Mary Mead to look more carefully beneath the surface of respectability, to question the motives of those who claimed moral authority, and to protect the vulnerable from those who would sacrifice them on the altar of ideological purity. On a peaceful evening in late spring, as Miss Marple sat watching the last light fade over the village she had come to understand so thoroughly, she reflected on the complete pattern that had emerged from the case. The mystery had been solved not through forensic brilliance, but through patient observation of human nature in all its fascinating, troubling complexity. The heritage fete had indeed showcased tradition, but not the charming customs Mrs. Blackwood had intended to celebrate. Instead, it had revealed the eternal truth that the most dangerous individuals were often those who saw themselves as unequivocally virtuous, and that vigilance against such moral certainty remained one of humanity's most necessary skills. As the church clock struck 9 and familiar evening sounds settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to her cottage. The bride who had slept in the wrong coffin had finally found her peace, and in doing so had taught an entire community lessons about tolerance, genuine virtue, and moral courage that would protect them for generations to come. The heritage she left behind was not the rigid tradition Mrs. Blackwood had tried to impose through death, but the living legacy of a community that had learned to distinguish between preserving what was valuable from the past and protecting the freedom of those who chose to build something new for the future. In the end, Miss Marple understood as she settled by her fireside with her knitting that was perhaps the most important heritage of all: the wisdom to know that true virtue lay not in rigid adherence to tradition, but in the courage to protect others' right to choose their own path through life, even when that path led away from familiar certainties toward an uncertain but freely chosen future. The mystery was complete, but its lessons would endure as long as communities existed, where people must balance the preservation of what they valued with the protection of those who dared to live differently. And somewhere in England, Miss Marple knew, other villages were learning similar lessons about the delicate art of distinguishing between moral leadership and moral tyranny, between tradition and fanaticism, between the desire to preserve and the need to protect individual freedom from those who would eliminate it in service of their vision of virtue.